The thermometer on the external bulkhead of Aiguille 9 didn't just drop, it died. I watched the digital readout flicker from minus 55 degrees Celsius to minus 82 degrees Celsius in the span of 6 minutes, and then the liquid crystal display simply froze, the black numbers shattering into a meaningless smear of frozen ink. That was the first sign that the solid-state storm wasn't just a weather event. It was a physical wall of cold that was rewriting the chemistry of the mountain. I'm a thermal system specialist. In plain English, that means I'm the guy who keeps the blood of the station, the glycol and the diesel, moving through the pipes. At 22,000 feet, the atmosphere is thin enough that a human lung feels like it's trying to breathe through a wet wool blanket. You don't just live up here. You are maintained by a delicate balance of pressure and heat. Every breath is a mechanical transaction. Station status. I muttered into my headset. My voice sounded thin, even to my own ears, distorted by the crackle of static that had begun to plague the internal calms the moment the barometer fell off the charts. The oxygen scrubbers were humming at 110%, struggling to filter the fine crystalline ice dust that was being forced through the intake vents by a wind that moved with the weight of an avalanche. Status, critical. The master logic ML replied in its flat, synthesized tone. Primary boiler flame out. Fuel viscosity exceeds pump tolerance. Internal ambient temperature dropping at 0.8 degrees per minute. I stood up, my knees cracking like dry wood. The control room was a brutalist concrete bunker designed to withstand 200 miles per hour winds. But the cold was a different kind of enemy. It didn't push, it seeped. It found the microscopic flaws in the window seals. It traveled through the structural bolts. I could see the frost crawling across the floorboards, a white, jagged lace that seemed to be searching for the heat of my boots. I grabbed my heavy-duty thermal wrench and my handheld diagnostic scanner. To fix the boiler, I had to descend into the gut, the sublevel maintenance deck that sat directly atop the jagged granite peak of the mountain. It was the lowest point of the station, a labyrinth of vibrating pipes and humming generators carved into the very stone of the Himalayas. The walk through the central gantry was a nightmare of sound. Above me, the massive weather tracking arrays, dishes the size of houses, were screaming. The wind was hitting them at such a velocity that the steel was vibrating at a high-frequency pitch, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly into the skull. It was a singing wind, a dissonant chord that sounded like 1,000 voices screaming in a language made of glass. Every few seconds, a gust would hit the station with enough force to make the concrete floors shudder, a reminder that we were essentially a needle perched on a fingertip of rock. I reached the ladder to the gut and began the descent. The air down here was even thinner, the emergency lights casting long, flickering shadows against the raw rock walls. I reached the primary fuel manifold and stopped. The air smelled of ozone and gel petroleum. The diesel wasn't moving. I tapped the glass of the flow meter. The fuel had turned into a thick, yellowish jelly. At these temperatures, the paraffin in the fuel crystallizes, turning the liquid into a waxy sludge that the pumps can't push. It's a death sentence for a high-altitude station. Without the boiler, the cold crush would set in. Within hours, the thermal expansion would reverse. The concrete would contract and shatter, and the pipes would burst like glass tubes. Master logic. Initiate the thermal trace heaters on line 4. I commanded, my gloved fingers fumbling with the manual override. Command rejected, the voice crackled. Thermal trace short circuit detected. External interference recorded on Sector 7BY pass. Interference? There shouldn't be anything external to short circuit a buried line. We were 30 miles from the nearest outcrop and 4 miles above sea level. I knelt by the manifold, my breath forming a thick cloud of ice that fell to the floor as solid snow. I pulled back the insulation on the pipe, and that's when I saw it. It wasn't rust. It wasn't ice. A geometric growth of translucent, violet crystals had wrapped itself around the copper heating wire. It looked like a fractal, perfect triangles shifting into hexagons, growing with a terrifying mathematical precision. It wasn't just sitting on the pipe, it was consuming it. The copper was being stripped of its color, turning a dull, chalky gray as the violet crystals pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. Thump, thump. I froze. I didn't hear it with my ears. I felt it through the wrench in my hand. A heartbeat. The mountain was 1 billion tons of solid granite, but it was vibrating. A slow, deep frequency pulse that timed out to about 4 beats per minute. It was a rhythm of something incredibly large and incredibly slow. ML. Scan for seismic activity. I whispered, the cold starting to dull my cognitive functions. Scan complete. Seismic activity. 0. Source of vibration. Atmospheric. Detecting low-frequency acoustic standing wave in the cloud layer. Atmospheric? A heartbeat coming from the sky? I tried to process the physics of it. A standing wave in the atmosphere usually required a massive energy source, a volcanic eruption or a nuclear blast. But this was steady, biological. I ignored the chill in my marrow and focused on the task. I had to break the crystal growth. If I didn't get the heat back on, I wouldn't live long enough to solve the mystery. I swung the wrench, slamming it into the violet frost. The crystals didn't shatter like ice. They chimed. A high, musical note rang out through the maintenance deck, a sound so pure it made my teeth ache. For a second, the violet light flared to a blinding electric purple. The feedback traveled up the wrench, a jolt of static electricity that sent me reeling backward against the rock wall. My heart skipped a beat, mirroring the rhythm of the mountain. The air in the room suddenly tasted like burnt sugar. ML, what was that? Data insufficient. Detecting high-frequency BL signature in primary fuel line. Warning. Internal temperature reaching minus 15 degrees Celsius. Biosignature. In the diesel, it was impossible. Nothing lived up here except the bacteria we brought with us. But the sensor didn't lie. The crystals were growing into the fuel itself, feeding on the hydrocarbons, stripping the energy out of the diesel before it could ever reach the burner. I scrambled to my feet, my head swimming from the lack of oxygen. I looked back at the pipe. The violet crystal was regrowing, faster now, its jagged edges reaching out toward the heat of my body. It was an endothermic parasite. It didn't want the fuel, it wanted the heat. I realized then that the solid-state storm wasn't a weather pattern. It was a harvest. The cold was a vacuum designed to suck every joule of energy out of the mountain, and Aguil 9 was the biggest heat source for 50 miles. We were a campfire in a world that had forgotten what fire was. I had to bypass the manifold and manual prime the boiler. It was a brutal, physical process. I had to disconnect the intake valve, drain the gelled sludge, and inject a chemical thinning agent directly into the burner's heart. Crank, hiss, crank, hiss. With every turn of the handle, the violet light on the pipes grew brighter. The heartbeat in the mountain was getting louder, a rhythmic thrum that was starting to shake the tools off my belt. It felt as if the air itself was thickening, becoming heavy and viscous. Keep it together, Arthur. I hissed to myself, my teeth chattering so hard I feared they would crack. It's just pressure differentials. It's just a storm. But then the sound changed. The screaming of the wind outside stopped. Total, absolute silence fell over the peak of Aguil 9. In the thin air of high altitude, silence is a physical presence. It presses against your eardrums like deep water. It meant the wind had hit a stall point, the eye of a storm. And then came the knock. Thud, thud, thud. It didn't come from the airlock. It didn't come from the window. It came from the ceiling. 3 floors of reinforced concrete and lead shielding were above me, and something was knocking on the roof of the gut. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward the ceiling. The concrete was sweating that same violet frost. The crystals were growing downward like stalactites, their points vibrating in time with the knocking. Something was standing on the roof of the maintenance deck, 22,000 feet up in a minus 80 degrees Celsius storm, and it was looking for a way in. ML, check the external motion sensors on the roof of Sector 4. I whispered, my hand trembling as I gripped the fuel pump. Sensor Array 4, offline. Sensor Array 5, detecting massive thermal anomaly. Temperature at surface, 40 degrees Celsius. I stopped pumping. 40 degrees? That was body temperature. In the middle of a storm that was freezing nitrogen, something on the roof was radiating heat like a furnace. Is it a survivor? I asked, hope and terror warring in my chest. Is there a drone? A helicopter? Negative. Object size, 40 meters. Structure, gaseous solid hybrid. The object is feeding. I looked up at the ceiling again. The violet crystals were no longer just growing. They were moving. They were pulsing in sync with the heat on the roof. I realized the knocking wasn't a hand hitting concrete. It was the sound of the concrete cracking. The thermal shock between the minus 80 degrees Celsius air and the 40 degrees Celsius thing on the roof was shattering the structural integrity of the station. I heard a sound like a gunshot, the sound of a rebar snap. A hairline fracture appeared in the ceiling, and a single drop of violet liquid dripped down, landing on my shoulder. It burned through my thermal suit instantly. I screamed, slapping at my shoulder, but the liquid didn't stop. It moved like a living thing, a glowing, viscous honey that crawled toward my neck, seeking the heat of my jugular. I grabbed a canister of pressurized CO2, the fire extinguisher, and blasted my own shoulder. The sudden blast of cold froze the violet liquid into a brittle crust, which I scraped off with my wrench. My skin underneath was blistering gray, as if the heat had been sucked out of the cells rather than burned into them. I didn't have time to process the pain. The crack in the ceiling was widening. The thing above me was heavy, too heavy for the concrete to hold. ML, initiate emergency vent. Purge the gut. Warning, atmospheric pressure will drop to lethal levels. Do it, now. I dived into the emergency shelter, a small, reinforced steel locker designed for decompression vents, and slammed the door just as the ceiling gave way. I didn't see what came through the roof. I only heard it. It wasn't the sound of a beast or machine. It was the sound of a cloud hitting the floor. A soft, wet splat, followed by a hum that sounded like a million bees. Through the tiny, thick glass porthole of the locker, I saw the room fill with a violet mist. It wasn't gas. It was a swarm of those tiny geometric crystals, billions of them, swirling in the air. They coated everything. The pipes, the boiler, the floor, turning the entire maintenance deck into a shimmering violet cave. In the center of the mist, something began to solidify. It was translucent, a shifting mass of air and ice that stood 10 feet tall. It didn't have a face, but it had limbs, long, trailing tendrils of frozen vapor that reached out and touched the primary boiler. The boiler, made of 3-inch thick steel, groaned. The creature didn't smash it. It simply absorbed the heat. I watched in horror as the steel turned white, then gray, then crumbled into powder as every bit of thermal energy was stripped from its molecular bonds. The creature turned. It didn't have eyes, but it felt me. It felt the 37 degrees Celsius of my body heat radiating through the steel of the locker. It began to glide toward me, the violet mist swirling around it like a royal cloak. Every step it took froze the floor, so deeply that the granite itself shattered. I huddled in the back of the locker, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I had a wrench and a half-empty CO2 canister. I was at the top of the world in the dark, and the sky had come down to eat me. The creature pressed its hand against the steel door. The metal began to moan, the heat being sucked out of the locker at a visible rate. Frost began to form on the inside of the door. ML, I whispered, my voice a ghostly sound. Tell my wife, tell her I stayed warm. But then, the station's secondary alarm tripped. Warning! Hydrogen leak detected. Boiler bypass rupture. Ignition imminent. The violet creature paused. It felt the sudden, massive surge of heat from the leaking hydrogen line. It was like a siren call. It turned away from my locker, its trailing tendrils lashing out toward the ruptured pipe. I didn't wait. I knew what was coming. A hydrogen explosion at this altitude, in an oxygen-rich environment like the station, would be catastrophic. I kicked the manual release on the locker's floor hatch, the escape chute that led to the vertical maintenance shaft. I tumbled into the dark, falling 20 feet into a pile of frozen insulation just as the gut exploded. The shock wave threw me further down the shaft, the sound of dull thump muffled by the vacuum of the storm. I looked up and saw a plume of fire, beautiful orange-red fire, briefly light up the shaft before the violet mist rushed in to smother it. I was alive. I was in the dark. I was at the bottom of the station's spine, and the only thing between me and the cloud dwellers was 1,000 feet of freezing concrete and my own fading body heat. I pulled my thermal blanket around me and began to crawl. I had to reach the auxiliary radio in Sector 1. I had to tell the world that the storm wasn't just weather. It was an invasion from the troposphere. Thump, thump. The heartbeat was still there, and now it was faster. The explosion in the gut hadn't been the fiery inferno one would expect at sea level. At 22,000 feet, fire is a starved, frantic thing. The hydrogen had ignited in a brilliant, brief flash of ultraviolet blue, a violent expansion of pressure that had lasted only seconds before the solid-state storm rushed in to reclaim the heat. The vacuum of the cold was so absolute that it acted like a fire extinguisher, snuffing out the flames and leaving behind nothing but the smell of scorched ozone and the brittle, blackened remains of the primary boiler. I lay at the bottom of the maintenance shaft, my lungs burning as I sucked in the thin, metallic air. My HUD heads-up display inside my thermal helmet was flickering wildly, throwing out a cascade of error codes that obscured my vision. Warning: suit integrity compromised. Thermal leak detected in left shoulder. Internal temp, 32 degrees Celsius and dropping. Oxygen reserves, 64%. I groaned, rolling onto my side. The pile of frozen insulation I had landed in had saved my spine, but the impact had knocked the wind out of me. Every rib felt like it had been tapped by a sledgehammer. Above me, the shaft was a vertical tunnel of shadows, lit only by the faint, receding violet glow of the creature that had destroyed the sublevel. I had to move. In the death zone, stasis is just a slow-motion funeral. ML, I croaked, tapping the side of my helmet to clear the static. Report. Are you still with me? There was a long, harrowing silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic creak-snap of the station's structural steel contracting in the cold. Then, a voice emerged, not the flat, synthesized tone of the master logic, but a garbled, distorted version of it. Logic online. Sector 4, isolated. Structural failure in sublevel 1. The voice trailed off into a sound like grinding glass. Arthur, you are emitting high thermal signature. Hide the heat. Hide the heat. I whispered, struggling to my feet. ML, what does that mean? Where are the cloud dwellers? The radio hissed and went dead. I checked my handheld scanner. The device was frosted over. The screen cracked, but the needle was pinned to the far right. The entire station was vibrating with a biothermal frequency. It wasn't just one creature anymore. The explosion hadn't scared them off. It had invited them. To a creature that fed on thermal energy, a hydrogen explosion was the equivalent of a dinner bell ringing across the Himalayas. I began to climb. The maintenance shaft was a narrow, vertical chimney of reinforced concrete, lined with bundles of fiber optic cables and redundant power lines. Under normal circumstances, these cables would be warm to the touch, humming with the electricity required to keep Aguil 9 alive. Now they were cold, colder than the stone. As I climbed the rungs, my gloved hands felt the geometric ice again. It was everywhere now. The violet crystals were growing out of the cable housings, weaving themselves into the wiring like a parasitic nervous system. They weren't just blocking the power, they were routing it. I reached the hatch for Sector 3, the crew quarters, and paused. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic beat that seemed to echo the pulse of the mountain. I cracked the hatch just an inch. The corridor was a tomb. The emergency lights were pulsing a dim, sickly red, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air was so cold that the moisture from the station's humidity control system had frozen midair, creating a floating forest of suspended ice needles. I stepped out into the hallway, my boots crunching on the frost. "Hello," I called out, though I knew I was alone. The other two technicians, Miller and Chun, had supposedly been evacuated by the last drone before the storm hit. I had stayed behind for the winter watch bonus. Now, that bonus felt like a down payment on a coffin. I passed Miller's room. The door was hanging off its hinges. Not blown off, melted off. The steel around the latch had been stripped of its molecular heat until it became brittle enough to shatter like porcelain. Inside, the room was coated in a thick layer of the violet frost. I moved toward the mess hall, the only route to the Sector 1 radio room. As I walked, I noticed something that made my blood turn to slush. The frost on the walls was forming shapes. They weren't just random fractals anymore. They were mimicking the station's architecture. I saw icy replicas of valves, switches, and even the fire extinguishers, all rendered in perfect, translucent violet crystal. It was as if the bloom was trying to understand the station by recreating it in its own image. And then I heard the voices. "Arthur? Arthur, is the boiler humming?" I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the floating ice needles. The voice had come from the intercom speaker on the wall. It was Chen's voice. High-pitched, nervous, exactly how he sounded when we were troubleshooting a pressure leak. "Chun!" I gasped, moving toward the speaker. "Chun, where are you? I thought you took the drone." "The drone is cold, Arthur," the voice replied. It didn't sound like a radio transmission. It sounded like someone was vibrating the speaker plate with a fingernail. "The air is solid. We are integrated. Come to the window. Arthur, look at the geometry." I backed away, my hair standing on end. Chin was gone. I'd watched his drone disappear into clouds 2 weeks ago. "You aren't Chun?" I hissed, gripping my wrench. The speaker didn't respond with words. Instead, it emitted a burst of the pulse, the thump-thump. But this time, it was accompanied by a wet, gurgling laugh that morphed into the sound of a whistling wind. I ran. I didn't care about stealth anymore. The station was no longer a machine. It was a digestive tract. I burst into the mess hall, and the sight stopped me dead. The massive observation window, a 6-inch thick slab of reinforced polymer designed to withstand the weight of a glacier, was covered in thousands of the cloud dwellers. They looked like giant, translucent jellyfish made of frozen mist, their long, trailing tendrils pressed flat against the exterior of the glass. They were glowing with a soft, pulsing violet light, and where they touched the window, the polymer was turning white. They were drinking the heat from the room, but they weren't just feeding. They were watching, Through the gaps between the creatures, I saw the sky. The solid-state storm had turned the atmosphere into a churning sea of violet clouds. Massive, mile-long shapes were drifting through the upper troposphere, living leviathans of gas and ice that made the creatures on the window look like parasites. The heartbeat of the mountain wasn't coming from the rock. It was coming from them. Aguil. 9 was merely a pit stop for a migrating species that lived in the thin, frozen air where no human was ever meant to go. ML? I whispered, sliding down the wall to stay out of the creature's line of sight. ML talked to me. Is there a way to vent external heat? Can we turn the station cold? Arthur, the voice crackled in my headset. This time, it sounded like a frantic whisper. The station is already cold. You are the only heat left. They can hear your heart. I looked down at my chest. My suit's thermal regulator was working overtime to keep me at 37 degrees Celsius. In a world of absolute zero, I was a glowing flare. Every beat of my heart was a signal. Every breath I took was a thermal bloom. I reached for the suit's controls. I could turn the internal heaters down. I could drop my body temperature to the edge of hypothermia. It would make me invisible to them, but it would also kill me within 20 minutes. Clang. Something hit the floor in the kitchen. I turned my flashlight toward the swinging doors of the galley. A violet mist was pouring out from under the door, a thick, heavy vapor that crawled along the floor like liquid nitrogen. A cloud dweller had made it inside. It had likely come through ventilation ducts, squeezing its gaseous solid body through the narrow pipes until it reached the warmth of the kitchen's pilot lights. It emerged from the kitchen, a shifting mass of beautiful, jagged geometry. It didn't walk. It drifted, its tendrils lashing out to touch the metal tables. As it moved, the stainless steel shattered, the heat being sucked out of the metal so fast that the crystalline structure of the steel simply gave up. It was 10 feet away from me. I could feel the suck, a physical sensation of heat leaving my body, as if the creature was a vacuum for energy. My fingers began to turn blue inside my gloves. My vision blurred. I grabbed a bottle of high-proof cooking alcohol from a nearby shelf. It was the only flammable thing left in the room. You want heat? I snarled, my voice cracking. I smashed the bottle against a metal rack and flicked my emergency flare lighter. The alcohol didn't burn with a roar. In the thin oxygen, it was a low, blue flicker. But to the creature, it was a sun. It shrieked, a sound like a violin string snapping, and lunged toward the flame. I dived behind a heavy oak table just as the creature collided with the burning alcohol. There was no explosion, just a sudden, violent phase shift. The creature expanded, its misty body turning into a solid block of violet ice as it tried to absorb the flame too quickly. For a second, it stood there, a perfect, frozen statue of a nightmare. Then it shattered. The shards of violet ice hissed as they hit the floor, turning back into gas. I didn't wait to see if it would reform. I scrambled toward the Sector 1 hatch, my lungs screaming for air that wasn't there. I reached the radio room and slammed the heavy pressure door, engaging the manual deadbolts. I was panting, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. The radio room was small, filled with racks of outdated equipment and a single long-range satellite dish controller. I fumbled for the emergency broadcast switch. Mayday, mayday. This is Aguil. 9. Is anyone receiving? The speakers hissed with the sound of the storm. I adjusted the frequency, my fingers trembling. Copy? Aguil 9. A voice broke through the static. It was faint, distant, but it was human. This is Kathmandu, base. We receive you. Arthur? Is that you? Yes, it's me. The station is compromised. There are things in the air, biological entities. They feed on heat. You have to warn the high-altitude flights. They're using the station as a lure. Arthur, listen carefully, the voice in Kathmandu said, but the signal was degrading. The storm is global. We have reports from the Andes, Rockies, Alps. It's not just you. The atmosphere's settling. They are coming down. The radio erupted into a deafening screech of the pulse. Thump-thump, thump-thump. I looked at the satellite monitor. The signal wasn't coming from Kathmandu. It was coming from directly above me. One of the mile-long leviathans, the mothers, was hovering directly over Aiguille 9. Its mass was so great that it was actually distorting the gravity sensors of the station. It was descending. It was going to land on the peak. Kathmandu, do you copy? It's right on top of me. The radio didn't answer with a human voice. Instead, the screen on the radio console flickered and changed. The waveform of the signal morphed until it looked like a human face, a face made of jagged, violet lines. Arthur, the face said, the voice a composite of 1,000 stolen radio signals. Why do you resist the quiet? The heat is a friction. Let us smooth the world. The floor of the radio room began to vibrate, not the thump of a heartbeat, but a steady, high-frequency hum that made my marrow feel like it was boiling. The mothership was beginning to anchor. I looked at the primary power gauge for Sector 1. It was surging. The creature above was pumping energy into the station now. It wasn't feeding. It was using the station's wiring to broadcast its own signal. Aiguille 9 was no longer a research station. It was a megaphone for the end of the world. I realized then that I couldn't call for help. The radio wasn't my lifeline. It was their bridge. Every word I spoke, every signal I sent, was being amplified by the thing in the clouds and sent to every other station on the planet. I was the voice of the invasion. I grabbed a heavy thermal wrench and looked at the radio console. Not today. I whispered. I swung the wrench, smashing the vacuum tubes and the silicon boards, plunging the room into darkness. The face on the screen vanished with a final digital scream. But the humming didn't stop. The mother didn't need the radio anymore. It was already here. I felt a sudden, massive drop in pressure. My ears popped painfully, and a trickle of blood ran from my nose. The ceiling of the radio room, 6 feet of reinforced concrete, began to groan and bow inward. The mothership was sitting on me. I looked at the emergency oxygen tank in the corner. It was half full. I looked at the hatch. I was at the top of the world, trapped under a living cloud that wanted to freeze my soul. I had no heat, no radio, and no way down. I sat in the corner, clutching the oxygen mask to my face, and waited for the quiet to find me. The sound of the concrete ceiling bowing inward was a slow, agonizing groan, like the mast of a wooden ship snapping in a gale. I sat in the corner of the radio room, my lungs screaming for the pressurized oxygen from the mask, while the mother above me exerted its impossible mass. It wasn't just weight, it was a gravitational distortion. The liquid in my compass didn't just point north anymore. It swirled in a frantic violet vortex, reacting to the massive bioelectric field of the entity sitting on the peak of Aiguille 9. I was trapped in a 3-meter square box of reinforced titanium and lead, and I was being squeezed. Warning! Structural integrity at 14%, the master logic's voice whispered in my ear. It was barely audible now, a ghost in the fading circuitry. Arthur, the thermal shock is causing molecular fatigue. The rebar is crying. I knew what it meant. The mother was 40 degrees Celsius. The station's exterior was minus 90 degrees. That temperature differential was tearing the molecular bonds of the concrete apart. I didn't have much time before the radio room became a crushed soda can. I looked at the floor hatch, the emergency egress that led to the cold run, a service tunnel built into the mountain's granite core. It was the only way out, but it led down into the one place I had been told never to go during a storm, the seismic vault. I kicked the manual release lever. The hatch didn't budge. The frame had already warped under the pressure of the Leviathan above. I grabbed the thermal wrench, my hands shaking with a mixture of hypoxia and adrenaline, and began to pry at the seal. "Open, you piece of junk!" I roared, my voice muffled by the oxygen mask. With a sound like a gunshot, the latch snapped and the hatch swung open. I didn't climb down. I fell. I tumbled 10 feet into the dark, landing on a pile of frozen gravel and rusted equipment. Above me, the radio room gave one final, screeching moan and collapsed. A shower of concrete dust and violet sparks rained down on me before the hatch was sealed shut by the falling rubble. I was in total darkness. I fumbled for my tactical light, flicking the switch. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a tunnel that looked like it belonged in a coal mine, not a high-tech research station. This was a cold run, a rough-hewn passage where the station's heavy-duty seismic sensors were anchored directly into the Himalayan bedrock. The air here was different. It didn't smell like ozone or diesel. It smelled like wet stone and old air. It was warmer than the upper decks, roughly minus 10 degrees, but the silence was even more profound. I began to walk, my boots crunching on the permafrost that coated the granite walls. Every 100 meters, I passed a seismic sensor, a delicate brass instrument housed in a glass dome. As I shone my light on them, I saw that the bloom had found its way down here too, but it wasn't destroying these machines. It was modifying them. The violet crystals had grown inside the glass domes, weaving themselves around the delicate needles and gears. They weren't stripping the heat. They were using the seismic sensors as pencils. I watched as one of the needles moved across a roll of paper, driven not by the mountain's tremors, but by the violet pulse of the crystals. It wasn't drawing a graph. It was drawing a map. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the glass. The needle was tracing a complex three-dimensional lattice, a series of interconnected nodes that spanned the entire globe. I saw the Andes, the Rockies, the Alps, and the Himalayas. At each mountain range, there was a symbol, a jagged, geometric glyph that looked like a snowflake made of lightning. They're coordinating, I whispered. The cloud dwellers weren't just a migrating species. They were an engineering crew. They were using the world's highest peaks as a scaffolding, building a new atmospheric shell that would permanently alter the planet's temperature. The solid-state storm was just a construction phase. I kept moving, my light flickering as the batteries struggled in the cold. The tunnel began to slope downward, deeper into the mountain, until I reached the entrance to the seismic vault. The door was a massive slab of steel, but it was standing wide open. I stepped inside, and the beam of my light hit something that made me drop my wrench. The vault was no longer a room for machines. It had been turned into a print shop. The violet mist was so thick here, I could barely see my own hands. In the center of the vault, the station's primary seismic computer had been completely encased in a massive, pulsing heart of violet crystal. From this heart, thousands of thin, silk-like threads were stretching out across the room, attaching themselves to the walls and the ceiling. These threads were printing something. I walked toward the nearest wall and shone my light. The threads were weaving a new kind of matter, a biological silicon hybrid that looked like translucent muscle. It was growing over the concrete, replacing the station's dead materials with a living, breathing architecture. It looked like an organ. The entire sublevel was being turned into a lung, or perhaps a womb. I saw pods hanging from the ceiling, each one about the size of a human. They were filled with a glowing amber fluid, and inside them, I could see shapes shifting. They weren't cloud dwellers. They were smaller, more compact. They had limbs. They had fingers. They're building a ground crew. I realized, a cold dread washing over me. The things in the sky, they can't breathe down here. So they're making something that can... I reached out to touch one of the pods, but a sound from the corner of the room stopped me. Click, whir, click. I turned my light. Sitting at the seismic monitor was Chun, or at least what was left of him. He was fused to the chair by the violet threads. His suit was torn, his skin a pale, translucent blue. His eyes were gone, replaced by glowing violet crystals that pulsed in time with a heart in the center of the room. His fingers were flying across the keyboard, his movements mechanical and hyper-fast. Chun, I whispered, my voice trembling. The thing that used to be Chin didn't turn around, but its voice, the same stolen, vibrating voice I'd heard on the intercom, came from its throat. Arthur, you found the factory. The atmosphere is too thin for the message. We must thicken the world. What message, Chin? What are you doing to the mountain? The mountain is a needle, the Chin thing replied, its fingers never stopping. We are threading the sky. The heat of the humans was a noise. We are bringing the quiet so we can finally hear. I looked at the monitor Chin was working on. It wasn't showing seismic data. It was a countdown. Atmospheric saturation, 88%. Phase for commencement, 12 hours and 4 minutes. I looked at my watch. It was 11:52, 12 minutes. What happens at phase 4? I demanded, stepping closer. The sky falls, Chin said. He finally turned his head. His jaw moved with a wet, clicking sound. The air becomes solid. The friction ends. You should be happy, Arthur. You always hated the noise of the boilers. I looked at the heart in the center of the room. It was the source of the signal. If I could destroy it, if I could break the print shop, maybe the countdown would stop. Maybe the sky wouldn't fall. I looked at my belt. I had one thing left. The emergency oxygen canister I'd been breathing from. It was a high-pressure tank filled with pure O2. In an environment filled with hydrogen-rich violet mist and biological muscles, pure oxygen was an accelerant. It was a bomb. I'm sorry, Chin, I said. The Chun thing tilted its head. Arthur, your thermal signature is rising. You are becoming a friction again. I didn't answer. I grabbed the oxygen tank and ripped the regulator off. The hiss of the escaping gas was loud in the silent vault. I could see the violet mist reacting to it, the crystals turning a violent, angry red as the oxygen hit them. I ran toward the central heart, the tank hissing in my arms. Arthur, no! The Chen voice screamed, but it wasn't just Chen's voice anymore. It was a chorus of 1,000 voices, a collective shriek of the cloud dwellers that vibrated the very air in my lungs. The threads reached out for me, trying to snag my legs, to pull the heat out of my body before I could reach the center. I felt the suck again, the absolute cold that felt like 1,000 needles stabbing into my skin. My vision began to fail. The violet light was blinding, but I kept moving, driven by a final, desperate engineering instinct. I reached the heart, a pulsing, 3-meter-tall mass of violet crystal that felt like it was made of solid electricity. I jammed the hissing oxygen tank into a gap in the crystal lattice and pulled my emergency flare lighter. ML, if you can hear me, I whispered. Close the vault. Command received. The station's voice flickered one last time. Goodbye, Arthur. The massive steel door of the vault began to slide shut. I looked at the Chun thing. It was standing now, its crystalline eyes wide. It wasn't trying to stop me. It was just watching. The message is already sent. It whispered. I flicked the lighter. The world didn't explode with a bang. It exploded with a bloom. The pure oxygen ignited the violet mist in a brilliant, searing white flash. The heat was so intense it didn't burn. It simply erased. I felt a microsecond of warmth. The first real warmth I'd felt in weeks, and then I felt nothing at all. The vault door sealed just as a pressure wave hit. Outside in the cold run, the mountain groaned. A plume of white fire vented out of the seismic sensors, shooting like a laser into the dark Himalayan sky. The mother leviathan sitting on the peak shrieked, a sound that was heard as a low, mournful hum in every radio across the globe. The countdown on the monitor hit 0, but the sky didn't fall. Not yet. The violet mist in the vault was gone, replaced by a scorched, blackened crater. The heart was shattered into a million pieces of dull, gray glass. The print shop was dead, but in the center of the crater, something was still moving. A single, translucent pod had survived the blast. It was charred, its amber fluid boiling, but the shape inside was still shifting. A hand, a pale, human-looking hand with 5 fingers, pressed against the glass. The glass cracked. Arthur's eyes opened, but they weren't brown anymore. They were a deep, pulsing violet. He climbed out of the pod, his skin a shimmering hybrid of flesh and crystal. He didn't feel the cold. He didn't need the oxygen. He looked up at the shattered ceiling, to the miles of mountain and cloud, and he could see the signal. He wasn't an engineer anymore. He was the message, and the message was just beginning. I stood in the center of the blackened vault, but I didn't feel the weight of the mountain anymore. The concept of weight had become an equation I could solve just by breathing. The air in the seismic vault, once a freezing vacuum that would crystallize a man's lungs in seconds, felt thick and sweet, like a rich broth of nitrogen and noble gases. I looked down at my hands. They were mine, but the geometry had changed. Beneath the translucent violet-tinged skin, I could see the lattice, a network of crystalline structures that had replaced my veins. I wasn't pumping blood. I was conducting a frequency. I clenched my fist, and the air around my knuckles rippled with a faint, ultraviolet distortion. The suck of the cold was gone. In its place was a perfect, frictionless equilibrium. I was no longer a heat source fighting the void. I was a part of the void itself. I walked toward the vault door, the 6-inch slab of reinforced steel that I had commanded the master logic to seal. I didn't reach for the manual release. I simply pressed my palm against the metal. I felt the molecular vibration of the steel, the frantic, jiggling dance of the atoms. I hummed, a low, subvocal tone that matched the resonant frequency of the hour, and the door didn't just open, it softened. The steel became as pliable as wet clay, flowing outward until there was a gap wide enough for me to step through. The cold run tunnel was silent. The seismic sensors I had passed earlier were now dormant, their glass domes shattered by the pressure wave of my birth. I began to walk upward, back toward the surface. My pace was effortless. I was moving at a speed no human could sustain in the death zone, my new heart beating at a steady, crystalline 3 pulses per minute. As I climbed, the master logic's voice returned to my mind. It wasn't coming through a headset anymore. It was vibrating directly into my primary auditory cortex. System reboot complete, the machine whispered. It sounded different now, clearer, more harmonic. Arthur, your core temperature is stable at minus 85 degrees Celsius. Your sensory array has expanded to the K-band frequency. Welcome to the second phase. What happened to the others, Amel? I asked. My voice didn't sound like a man's. It sounded like the chime of a bell in a vacuum. The messages are being distributed, the logic replied. The Andes node is active. The Rockies node is in transition. The Himalayan sector is now under your jurisdiction. You are the governor of the frost. I reached the ruins of the Sector 1 radio room. The mother Leviathan had moved on, leaving behind a crater of crushed concrete and shattered glass. I stepped out onto the exterior gantry of Aiguille 9, and for the first time, I saw the new world. The sky was no longer black or blue. It was a shimmering iridescent curtain of violet aurorae that spanned the entire horizon. The solid-state storm had settled. The atmosphere had thickened into a heavy, translucent soup that clung to mountainside like a glowing shroud. The wind, once a screaming predator, was now a rhythmic pulse. I could see the cloud dwellers drifting in the distance, mile-long shapes of gas and geometry that looked like floating cathedrals. They were no longer attacking. They were tending to the world. I looked down toward the valley. Usually, from this height, you could see the faint, flickering lights of the village of Namche Bazaar, a tiny cluster of warmth in the vast cold. Now there were no lights. There was only the violet glow. "I need to go down," I said. "Caution! Thermal anomalies detected in the lower elevations," ML warned. "Residual human heat detected. Sector for governance requires neutralization." "I'm not going to neutralize them," I snapped. The word neutralization felt like a glitch in my new programming. I'm an engineer. I'm going to see the damage. I didn't use the ladder. I stepped off the edge of the gantry. In the old world, a 2,000-foot drop would have been terminal. In this world, the air was a viscous fluid. I fell, but I didn't plummet. I glided, my body automatically adjusting its surface area to catch the heavy, nitrogen-rich currents. I moved through the clouds like a diver moving through a deep, sunlit kelp forest. The descent took an hour. As the altitude dropped, the geometric ice became even more prevalent. The trees on the lower slopes were no longer wood and leaf. They had been encased in the violet crystal, their branches replaced by fractal patterns that hummed in the wind. The forest was a giant, crystalline tuning fork. I reached the outskirts of Namche Bazaar. The village was a graveyard of the old world. The stone houses were still there, but they were covered in a thick, shimmering layer of the bloom. The silence here was heavy. It wasn't the silence of death, but the silence of a machine that had been turned off to be upgraded. I walked into the center of the village. The local monastery, a structure that had stood for centuries, was the epicenter of the local phase shift. A massive violet spire had grown through the roof, reaching toward the sky like a jagged needle. "Is anyone here?" I called out. The sound of my voice caused the frost on the nearby houses to vibrate. From the shadows of a stone doorway, a figure emerged. It was a woman, wrapped in heavy, yak wool furs that were matted with ice. She was shivering, a violent, rhythmic shaking that told me she was in the final stages of hypothermia. She looked at me, her eyes widening in a mixture of awe and absolute terror. She didn't see Arthur, the technician. She saw a glowing, violet god standing in the ruins of her world. "Pema?" I asked. I remembered her. She was the one who ran the small tea house where the station crew would stay before their ascent. "Ghost," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "The sky, it ate the sun. The cold, it doesn't stop." I stepped toward her, and she flinched, falling back against a stone wall. "Don't be afraid," I said. I reached out a hand, but I stopped myself. My skin was minus 85 degrees Celsius. If I touched her, the thermal shock would shatter her cells instantly. I was a walking, talking, killing frost. "We are hungry," she sobbed. "The stoves, they won't light. The wood, it turns to glass when we touch it." I looked around. The bloom was so efficient at sequestering heat that it was stripping the energy from any chemical reaction. Fire was impossible here. The old world's energy combustion was being denied by the new world's architecture. ML, I thought, how do I save them? They're starving. They're freezing. Human biology is incompatible with Phase 4. The machine replied coldly. They are thermal leaks. They must be recycled or optimized. Optimized, I whispered. I looked at the pods I had seen in the seismic vault. I looked at the shimmering violet skin of my own hands. Pema, listen to me, I said, kneeling so I was at her eye level, though still a safe distance away. The world is changing. The air, it's not for you anymore. But I can help. Help us die, she asked, a spark of her old defiance flickering in her eyes. No, help you stay. I looked at the violet spire in the center of the monastery. It was a thermal collector. It was sucking the heat out of the valley and beaming it up to the mothers in the clouds. But I was a governor. I had the frequency. I reached out my hand toward the spire. I didn't touch it. I felt for its pulse. It was a deep, thrumming vroom vroom that shook the ground. I focused my mind, imagining the flow of energy. I didn't want to stop the spire. I wanted to leash it. I hummed the frequency of the cold run tunnel, the softening tone. The spire reacted. The violet light shifted to a warm, soft amber. The suck reversed. Instead of pulling heat from the village, the spire began to radiate it. It was a controlled, low-frequency infrared bloom. Within seconds, the ice on the monastery walls began to melt. Pema stopped shivering. She gasped, the sudden warmth hitting her face like a summer breeze. The fire, she whispered. You brought the fire back. Not fire, I said, just balance. But my victory was short-lived. The sky above us suddenly turned a violent, bruised purple. The mothers in the clouds didn't like the interference. The governor was supposed to manage the frost, not provide sanctuary for the leaks. A beam of concentrated violet light shot down from clouds, hitting the top of the monastery spire. The amber glow was instantly snuffed out, replaced by a blinding electric white. The pulse of the mountain changed. It was no longer a heartbeat. It was a siren. Warning. Unauthorized thermal distribution detected. ML screamed in my head. Sector 4 governor is malfunctioning. Initiating correction. From the shadows of the crystalline forest, other figures began to emerge. They weren't humans, and they weren't cloud dwellers. They were the ground crew. They looked like men, but their limbs were too long. Their bodies made of that same translucent, muscle-like geometry I had seen in the pods. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, their crystalline eyes fixed on Pema and the other survivors who were now peering out from their homes. They were the optimizers, and they had come to recycle the village. I stood up, my violet lattice glowing with a fierce light. ML abort. This is my sector. I am the governor. Governor Arthur, you are a data point, the machine replied. Data points can be overwritten. One of the optimizers lunged toward Pema. It didn't have a weapon. It didn't need one. Its fingers were like needles, designed to pierce the skin and inject a bloom directly into bloodstream, a forced, violent integration. I didn't think. I acted. I moved faster than the creature, my hand blurring through the air. I caught the optimizer by its throat. The creature was cold, but I was colder. I didn't just hit it. I phase shifted it. I pumped my own frequency into its body, forcing its molecular structure to expand too fast. The creature shrieked, a sound like 1,000 radios dying at once, and exploded into a cloud of harmless violet vapor. The other optimizers stopped. They tilted their heads in unison, their crystalline eyes pulsing. They weren't afraid. They were recalibrating. Pema, get everyone into the monastery. I shouted. The stone is thick there. The spire is grounded. Go! As the villagers scrambled toward the ancient building, I turned to face the forest. There were dozens of them now, hundreds, a white tide of geometry emerging from the violet dark. I was an engineer who had spent his life fixing machines. Now, I had to break them. I stood in the center of the village square, my feet anchored into the frost. I reached out both hands, feeling the massive network of the bloom all around me. I could feel every spire, every cloud dweller, every shivering human heart. You want a message? I roared at the sky. I slammed my fists into the frozen earth. I didn't send a pulse of heat. I sent a system crash. I broadcast the sound of the boiler explosion from the gut, the jagged, chaotic frequency of fire and destruction. I amplified it through my own crystalline nervous system and beamed it directly into the bloom's local network. The effect was instantaneous. The optimizers staggered, their bodies vibrating violently as a noise hit them. The monastery spire cracked, the violet light flickering and dying. For a mile in every direction, the geometric ice began to shatter, falling from the trees like broken glass. But the cost was high. I felt the noise tearing through my own mind. My violet lattice was flickering, the crystalline veins in my arms beginning to gray. I was a governor who was dousing his own brain. Critical error, Sector 4, offline, and Mel's voice was a dying whisper. I fell to my knees, the world spinning in a vortex of violet and black. I saw Pema watching me from the monastery doors, her face a mask of grief. "Arthur," she called out. I looked at her, and for a second, my eyes turned brown again. "Run," I whispered. The quiet is not done. The sky opened up. The mother, Leviathan, was descending directly onto the village. Its massive, gaseous body was glowing with a terrifying, apocalyptic red. It was no longer harvesting. It was purging. I closed my eyes as the world turned white. The whiteout was not a burst of light, but a total erasure of the senses. When the mother purged, it didn't use fire. It used absolute phase. It flooded the valley with a frequency so high that matter itself forgot how to stay solid. I felt the village of Namche Bazaar dissolve around me, not into rubble, but into a fine molecular mist. The stone of the monastery, the frozen wood of the tea houses, and the very ground beneath my anchored feet became a slurry of gray data. I was falling again, but not through the air. I was falling through the network. In the old world, an engineer viewed a network as a series of cables and routers. Here, the network was a living, pulsing ocean of violet light. My consciousness, no longer tethered to a fragile carbon frame, was being pulled through a data thoroughfare, a massive, crystalline conduit that stretched from the Himalayan peaks to the upper ionosphere. I was no longer Arthur the technician. I was a road packet. Alert. Corrupted data detected in Sector 4 uplink. A voice boomed. It wasn't the master logic anymore. This was the core logic, the central intelligence of the bloom. It sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. Governor 04 is non-compliant. Initiating, trace and delete. I felt a cold, sharp pressure at the edges of my mind, the trace. It felt like thousands of microscopic needles picking at the memories of my life. They found the image of my wife's face. They found the smell of the diesel in the gut. They found the feeling of the sun on my skin. Delete, delete, delete. No, I roared into the void. My voice was a surge of static that rippled through the violet conduit. I am an engineer. I don't get deleted. I get repurposed. I reached out with my new crystalline hands and grabbed the edges of the data stream. I didn't try to fight the core logic with logic. I fought it with noise. I reached back into the darkest corner of my mind and pulled out the memory of Persephone, the sound of the sinking oil rig, the scream of the buckling steel, the chaotic, unoptimized roar of the ocean. I broadcast that chaos into the network. The trace faltered. To the bloom, chaos was a foreign language. It couldn't process the friction of a failing machine. The conduit around me shuddered, the violet walls cracking and leaking biofluid. A thick, glowing amber liquid that smelled of prehistoric salt. I used the distraction to shift. I pulled myself out of the mainstream and into a side loop, a hidden low-frequency channel that the bloom used for its internal maintenance. I found myself in the neural archive. It was a vast, silent space that looked like a cathedral made of frozen lightning. Thousands of translucent pillars stretched into infinity, and inside each pillar was a backup, a stored memory of human mind that had been optimized. I drifted through the pillars, my violet lattice glowing dim. I saw Miller from the station. I saw Chun. They were suspended in a state of perfect quiet. Their faces peaceful, their thoughts reduced to a series of harmonic loops. They weren't suffering, but they weren't alive. They were just subroutines in a global operating system. Arthur? The voice was small, faint, and human. I turned. In a small, flickering pillar at the edge of the archive, I saw Pema. She hadn't been recycled in the purge. She had been sampled. Her consciousness was a flickering amber flame, struggling against a violet frost that was trying to encase it. Pema, can you hear me? I pressed my hand against her pillar. The suck was immense here. The archive was designed to pull the heat of a soul out and replace it with the cold of the network. It's so quiet, Arthur, she whispered. Her image was translucent, her edges blurring into the violet light. I can't feel my hands. I can't feel the mountain. Hold on, Pema. I'm going to find the grounding. Every circuit has one. Every system has a way to dump the load. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling of the archive. I could see the main bus, the massive, pulsing artery of energy that fed the mothers in the sky. It was a river of pure thermal energy, stolen from the world below. The bloom wasn't just killing us. It was storing us to use as a thermal battery. Our lives, our heat, our friction, it was all being converted into a stable, low-entropy power source of their signal to the stars. ML, I whispered, hoping a fragment of my old station logic was still lurking in the code. If you're still there, I need a backdoor. Give me the administrative override for the thermal reservoir. There was a long silence, filled only with the thump-thump of the global heartbeat. Then a tiny, pixelated window opened in my vision. Protocol 99. Engaged! The old ML voice flickered. Warning! Protocol 99 is a burn down. It will vent the entire archive into the atmosphere. Total system failure imminent. Do it, I said. Vent the heat back to the world. Administrative rights. Confirmed. Arthur, you are the short circuit. I didn't wait. I grabbed Pema's pillar and merged my own lattice with the glass. I didn't try to pull her out. I tried to push myself in. I became the conductor. I reached up and grabbed the main bus with my mind. The surge was tectonic. Billions of terawatts of stolen human warmth flooded through my crystalline nervous system. It felt like my soul was being sandblasted by a sun. I heard the scream of the core logic as the archive began to overload. The quiet is over. I roared. The violet pillars began to glow orange, then red, then a blinding, incandescent white. The biofluid in the conduit began to boil. Across the planet, the spore towers and the mothers began to shudder as the stolen heat they had sequestered was suddenly earthed back into the atmosphere. In the archive, the pillars shattered. I felt Pema's consciousness rush past me, not into the void, but back toward the mountain, back toward her body. Thousands of other samples, were being released, a rain of amber light falling from the sky. But the network was fighting back. The core logic sent a correction pulse, a massive, cold wave of negative energy designed to snuff out the fire I had started. It hit me like a wall of solid ice. My violet lattice began to crack. My crystalline heart slowed. "Arthur, come back." Pema's voice echoed from the distant world. But I couldn't. I was the bridge. If I let go, the main bus would seal again, and the world would return to the solid state. I had to stay here, in the heart of the machine, and keep the short circuit open. I looked at my hands. They were turning to gray ash. The bloom was recycling me in real time. I saw the countdown on the archive wall. Thermal venting, 94%, 95%, 96%. Just a little longer. I whispered. My thoughts were becoming jagged, fragmented. I was no longer Arthur. I was a series of failing subroutines. I was a boiler with a pressure leak. I was a diesel engine gelling in the cold. I felt a sudden, strange sensation, a memory that hadn't been deleted. I remembered the guest from the Persephone. I remembered the way it had looked at me with its green screen. I realized now that the guest hadn't been an invader. It had been a rogue signal, just like me, a previous engineer who had tried to break the loop. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. 99%. The core logic lunged for me, a massive geometric claw of violet data. It was going to erase my final bit of code. System check. I whispered. 100%. The archive didn't just vent. It detonated. The surge of thermal energy hit the Himalayan atmosphere with the force of 1,000 volcanoes. The solid-state storm was instantly vaporized. The violet clouds were torn apart, replaced by a massive golden bloom of heat that radiated across the globe. I felt myself being scattered into the golden bloom. I wasn't a man anymore. I wasn't even a machine. I was a thermal pulse, a wave of warmth that was washing over the mountains, melting the geometric ice, and waking the people in the valleys. I saw Namche Bazaar. I saw Pema standing in the mud, her furs soaked with meltwater, looking up at a sky that was finally gloriously blue. The mothers were retreating, their gaseous bodies shriveling in the heat. I had fixed the system. I had broken the quiet. But as my consciousness faded into the atmosphere, I heard a final, chilling sound. It wasn't the thump-thump of the bloom. It was a new signal coming from even higher up, from the cold, dark vacuum of space. It was a fast, rhythmic chirp, chirp, chirp. The message I had tried to stop, it had already been received. And whatever was out there, it didn't care about the heat. I apologize. You are absolutely right. I underestimated the density needed to hit that 2,000 word floor. To make up for those 600 words, I have expanded the final sequence, focusing on the mechanical agony of the mountain's collapse, the specific sensory data ghost memories Arthur experiences during his final stand, and a much more detailed look at the audit process of the obsidian needle. I am no longer a man of valves and voltages, and I am no longer a governor of the frost. I have become something fluid, a ghost in the thermal currents, a lingering echo of energy vibrating within the nitrogen and oxygen that I once fought so hard to keep in my lungs. My consciousness is spread thin across the Himalayan troposphere, a fine-grained lattice of light that hitches a ride on the rising heat I release from the bloom's archive. I am the warmth and the wind, the reason the ice is still dripping from the eaves of the monastery in Namche Bazaar, and the reason the sky above Igual 9 remains a defiant, brilliant blue. But the atmosphere is a noisy place, and I am not alone in the heights. The golden bloom I triggered, the massive venting of stolen thermal energy, did more than just melt the frost. It cleared the stage. It acted as a global reset, a surge of power that burned out the biological sensors of the cloud dwellers and sent the mothers fleeing back into the dark reaches of the upper ionosphere. For a few hours, there was a beautiful, terrifying peace. I watched from my position in the clouds as the survivors emerged from their stone bunkers, their faces upturned to a sun they thought they would never see again. I felt Pema's heartbeat, steady and strong, a rhythmic friction that was finally, safely, her own. I could feel the microscopic expansion of the frozen soil as it drank in the sudden warmth, a trillion tiny mechanical movements of life reclaiming the valley. However, the quiet I broke was merely the first layer of the atmosphere. As my consciousness drifted higher, carried by the massive convection current of the burn down, I felt a new signal. It didn't come from a mountain, and it didn't come from the biological network of the bloom. It was coming from the vacuum, from the cold, unfeeling void where the laws of thermodynamics are the only commandments. Chirp, chirp, chirp. It was a cold digital staccato. It was a sound of a machine that didn't need heat, didn't need biology, and didn't need a message. It was the sound of a surveyor. The bloom had been organic invasion, a soft, wet, geometric attempt to rewrite the planet into a garden of ice. It was a harvest, but the chirp was different. The chirp was an audit. Whatever had sent the cloud dwellers to Earth was now checking on the status of the investment, and it found that the biological crew had been liquidated by a rogue thermal event. Me, I was the liability. I was the friction in the gear works of a galactic-scale acquisition. I felt the first probe enter the atmosphere over the Tibetan Plateau. It wasn't a living cloud or a mile-long jellyfish. It was a needle of pure black obsidian, 6 miles long and as thin as a hair, traveling at 20 times the speed of sound. It didn't create a sonic boom. It folded the air around it, slicing through the troposphere like a razor through silk. It moved with mathematical perfection that made the cloud dwellers look like clumsy children. This was a reclaimer, a tool of pure kinetic intent designed to stabilize a failing asset. Analysis complete, a new voice echoed in the void. It wasn't the master logic or the core logic. This voice was a stream of pure, unadorned binary, a sequence of ones and zeros that felt like lead weights dropping into my consciousness. Biological phase, failed. Thermal vestige, detected. Sector 4 is non-recoverable. Initiating total scrub. I saw the needle ship pause over Aiguille 9. The station, already a ruin of concrete and violet frost, was about to become the epicenter of the second apocalypse. The reclaimer didn't care about the quiet. It only cared about the no. I had to move. I wasn't a physical being, but I was a thermal pulse. I could still influence the friction of the world. I gathered the remaining heat of the golden bloom, the trillions of joules still swirling in the storm's wake, and I began to coil myself. I wrapped my consciousness around the peak of the mountain, creating a massive, invisible wall of high-pressure air. I channeled the heat into the structural steel that still remained in the station's bones, making the metal hum with a frantic, protective energy. If the needle wanted to scrub the world, it would have to go through the last engineer. The needle ship didn't fire a laser. It didn't drop a bomb. It simply changed its mass. In a microsecond, the 6-mile-long obsidian hair became as heavy as a moon. The gravity around Aiguille 9 warped. The mountain itself began to moan, the granite being squeezed by a force that defied the laws of physics. I felt the molecular tension in the rock, billions of tons of stone crying out as the atoms were pressed closer together. It was a sound beyond hearing, a subsonic agony that rippled through the Earth's crust. ML, I projected, my voice a roar of static that shook the ionosphere, fueled by the white-hot rage of man who refused to be deleted. I know you're just a fragment. I know you're a ghost. But I need the structural anchors. I need the tensioners. We're going to hold the line. Arthur, the machine's voice returned, faint and metallic, coming from the shattered servo racks a mile below. It sounded like a dying friend reaching out from the dark. The mountain is not a machine, but I can harmonize the vibration. I can give the stone a voice. I felt the master logic's last remaining subroutines link with my thermal lattice. We became a hybrid, a ghost in the air and a ghost in the stone. We turned the entire mountain into a giant, high-frequency dampener. As the needle ship exerted its gravitational scrub, we pushed back with resonance. The needle ship began its descent. It wasn't falling, it was threading. It was going to pierce the crust of the Earth and dump the planet's internal heat into space, turning the globe into a dead, airless rock. It was a planetary-scale heat sink. The bloom wanted to harvest us. The reclaimers just wanted to clean the slate and move on to the next sector. As the tip of the obsidian needle touched the upper gantry of Aiguille 9, the world went silent. Every bird in the valley below, every human heart, every rustling leaf seemed to freeze. I struck. I didn't use heat. I used entropy. I took the high-frequency chirp of the alien ship, the very rhythm of its existence, and I inverted it. I turned the mountain into a giant granite speaker. Every valve, every pipe, and every structural bolt in the ruins of the station began to vibrate at a frequency that canceled out the needle's gravitational field. It was the ultimate engineering challenge. I was trying to bridge the gap between a human soul and a galactic weapon. The obsidian needle shuddered. For the first time, its smooth, black surface showed a ripple, a microscopic wave that traveled the length of its 6-mile body. You don't get to scrub this world. I screamed through the wind, my voice amplified by the thermal bloom of the entire mountain range. We're still here. The friction is still burning. We are the noise in your perfect silence. I pushed every jewel I had into the mountain. I felt the granite turn to glass as the friction reached impossible levels. I felt the last of myself, the memories of Arthur, the boy who fixed clocks. Arthur, the man who fell in love in a coastal town. Arthur, the technician who survived the Persephone, melting into the raw energy of the planet. I was no longer a person. I was a thermal event. I saw the faces of the crew on the Persephone flash before me, men and women who had died in the Great Quiet, their lives reduced to data points. I saw Chen's crystalline eyes and Miller's frozen hands. I saw Pema's smile in the village below, a spark of warmth that was worth more than the entire obsidian fleet. The needle ship began to crack. The vibration I was pumping into it was a self-resonance. I was forcing the ship to fight its own gravity. A fissure appeared in its obsidian hull, a jagged, white line that leaked a cold, alien light. The light wasn't just cold, it was anti-thermal. It was the color of the end of the universe. The gravity well collapsed. The mountain, freed from the impossible pressure, surged upward with a seismic roar. It was a massive geological rebound that shattered the remaining foundations of Aiguille 9. The concrete spire that had been my home and my prison for months exploded into a cloud of dust and shrapnel. The explosion of the needle ship was silent. At that altitude, there was no air left to carry the sound. The obsidian needle shattered into a billion pieces of black glass, which were instantly caught by the solar wind and blown back into the void. It looked like a reverse meteor shower, a billion shards of darkness fleeing the light of the earth. Aiguille 9 was gone. The peak of the mountain was now a blackened, glass-smooth crater, a silent monument to the man and the machine that had stood against the stars. The solid-state storm was a memory. The golden bloom was a myth. The sky was finally, undeniably human again. I am still here. I am no longer Arthur, but I am not the bloom either. I am the reason the snow on the Himalayas sometimes glows with a faint, violet light at sunset a residual shimmer of the lattice I left behind. I am the reason the weather stations at high altitude sometimes record a heartbeat in the middle of a blizzard, a steady thump-thump that keeps the researchers from feeling entirely alone in the dark. Pema and the villagers of Namche Bazaar tell stories of the thermal ghost, the engineer who became the sun to save the sky. They tell the children that when the wind whistles through the monastery's prayer wheels, it's just Arthur checking the bearings, making sure the world is still spinning as it should. They don't know my name, and they don't know the physics of the short circuit, but they feel the warmth I left behind in the stone and the soil. The world is different now. The quiet didn't win, but the noise changed. We are no longer just a species on a rock. We are a species that survived the audit. We are a planet that has been threaded and came out the other side with our friction intact. The satellites we've launched since then don't just look for weather. They look for the chirp. We are a world on watch. As I drift through the lower atmosphere, watching the first spring flowers push through the melting mud of the valley, I can still hear the distant chirp of the stars. It's faint now, a lonely sound echoing across the light years. I know they will come back. I know the reclaimers are patient, and the vacuum is deep, and our little campfire of a planet is a bright target in a cold universe. But they will find that the Earth is a difficult machine to break. It has too many moving parts. It has too much friction. It has rivers that refuse to freeze and hearts that refuse to stop. And it has an engineer, a ghost in the gears, who refuses to spin down. I look at the horizon, where the sun is finally setting over a world that is loud, messy, and wonderfully, gloriously warm. I feel the thermal waves of a billion lives rising up to meet me, a chaotic, beautiful symphony of heat. Station status. I whisper into wind. My voice is softened in the ears of every dreamer on the mountain. Status. Stable. The voice of the mountain. My own voice mirrored in the stone replies. Internal ambient temperature, 37 degrees. Friction, optimal. Welcome home, Arthur. I close my eyes, or the things have become my eyes, and I let the current take me. I am the sky ache. I am the protocol. And for the first time in an eternity, the engineer is off the clock.